Welcome to Coffee and Conflict, a National Security Institute podcast where I sit down with leading authors and experts every fortnight to discuss some of their most recent works and the bigger picture of national security, foreign policy, and intelligence issues. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, a senior fellow at the National Security Institute and senior vice president at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. This season, we'll be covering topics ranging from the war in Ukraine, 21st century defense strategy, and the intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China, and more. So grab your first or second coffee of the day and let's begin. Today I'm joined by Bruce Hoffman and Jacob Ware, authors of God, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, out now from Columbia University Press. Bruce Hoffman is the Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been studying terrorism and insurgency for almost half a century, and I've certainly used his book Inside Terrorism in multiple of my courses and research previously. He's a tenured professor at Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he was previously the director for the Center for Jewish Civilization, as well as the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies Program. He's an honorary professor and professor emeritus of terrorism studies at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and has previously held positions at RAND Corporation and other organizations. Jacob Ware is a senior research fellow also at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he studies domestic international terrorism and counterterrorism. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he teaches a class on domestic terrorism, as well as at DeSales University. He serves on the editorial boards for the Academic Journal of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism and the Irregular Warfare Initiative, where I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Modern Warfare Institute at West Point University. Bruce and Jacob, welcome to Coffee and Conflict.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much.
This is a very timely book. We're recording this ahead of the forthcoming November elections, and it has been a great deal of conversation about the potential implications of the election and violence around the election. But I want to take a step back and start almost with a typology question, because I think this is a bit of a challenge for people in conversation. One of the key issues is, how does one define far-right and far-right terrorism? How would you define these concepts today?
Kick that to Jacob, because you've answered that question masterfully in the past.
Well, thank you so much for having us, Joshua. I always laugh when you read the bios, because my esteemed co-author, his bio is so long it doesn't mention the fact that he's actually the editor-in-chief of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism. My bio is so short that I get mentioned as a mere line editor. But anyway, it's a great honor to be with you here. We view far-right violent extremism as a terrorist movement, a violent movement driven by a multitude of ideologies defined by some form of hierarchy. That's the key word. People on the far right seek to defend their real or perceived hierarchy in society. Those hierarchies include hierarchies of race, gender, sexuality, place of birth, and so forth. So a white supremacist, who we would consider a far-right extremist, is trying to defend, protect a real or perceived hierarchy that they see in society. And what makes them a violent extremist, what makes them a terrorist, of course, to use Dr. Hoffman's definition from Inside Terrorism, is that they are violent, that they are political actors, and that they launch attacks seeking to spread psychological fear. So when you look down the lineage of attacks that we track in the book, from places like Charleston, South Carolina, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Christchurch, New Zealand, we are looking at people defending their perceived place in the world, their perceived place above a hierarchical summit from threats that they see to that hierarchy.
Bruce, if I may, if we track back in the book, you go all the way to the foundational antecedents of sort of the modern far-right terrorist movement, and with the creation of the KKK and the post-Civil War Reconstruction. I'm curious if you could talk about the genesis of that and how that has transcended the historical foundation to where we are today.
Well, that's really the jumping off point of the book, in the sense that Jacob and I write that hate groups have existed in the United States, arguably from the period of colonization, a century or more before the United States was actually created. But what we really focus on is the early 1980s, when this movement started to evolve from its hate, racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic character to adopt what was really quite unique and new, a very salient anti-government position, and to really harness sedition as one of its as one of its main goals. And that was a profound change. Now, in the 1980s, in an era before social media, for example, that manifested itself in sporadic, geographically diverse acts of terrorism, but there was no center of gravity. What we trace in the book is the trajectory from the 1980s through the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the United States Capitol to when we stopped really writing the book in 2022. We were in the midst of writing the book for almost well over a year when the January 6th events happened. But that was exactly our point, is that and the point of the book and our argument is that what we were seeing from 2020 onwards really was not something that was isolated or an aberration, but rather part of a continuum, part of a trajectory that you could trace back 40 years previously.
A lot of the events that you cover in the book are probably new for a lot of readers, certainly not the policy experts like yourselves, but Ruby Ridge, Waco, the Oklahoma City bombings are very much history for a lot of people. How instrumental were those events in terms of shaping the far-right movement, and how much did they reflect the far-right movement's evolution?
Well, that's a really good question. And this is where it was so interesting to write the book with Jacob, because we're 49 years apart. So a lot of the things that I wrote about at the beginning, Jacob was either very young or not even born yet. But it was something that even in the 1980s is when I first started tracking far-right terrorism and extremism. In fact, my first professional publication in 1982 was on right-wing terrorism in Europe, in Western Europe in particular. And then within a couple of years, I was focusing on the same phenomena in the United States. And what one sees is that these groups emerged in the 1980s and, as I said, moved away from just being about hate and racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia to anti-government and sedition. We see how at the end of the 1980s, the advent of the militia movement infused this with larger numbers and even a greater geographical and popular reach, but nothing compared to today with social media. And just as you described, Joshua, how Ruby Ridge in 1992 became the initial flashpoint. This was an incident where a former U.S. Army Green Beret, he and his family had decided to relocate to rural Idaho to live off the grid. And as part of his efforts to scratch out a living, he became enmeshed in a Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco firearms investigation that he was selling illegal weapons. And this investigation went on for some time. He knew that he was being watched. He also was embracing very much of an anti-government position and just wanted to be left alone, living in rural Idaho. And then he found he was out hunting basically with his son and his dog and discovered that there were Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm, ATF agents, were surrounding his house and surveilling him. And this led to a prolonged standoff. The FBI got involved, and in the course of the standoff, Randy Weaver, the former Green Beret, his wife was killed and his infant child as well. And this underscored for many people that the United States government had gone from, in their view, in this community or this milieu, had gone from protecting and defending the rights of citizens to actually becoming a predatory, aggressive force that was actively seeking confrontation. So that was the first, let's say, poster child incident. And what happened is that as Randy Weaver and his rural home were being besieged, supporters and sympathizers began to gather on the road outside there and to attract media attention. And one realized that the ethos that Randy Weaver was espousing were not unique to him, that there was actually a movement that was very anti-government. And that now took it as a justification that they were entitled to bear arms against the U.S. government because it had turned on its citizens. And then the following year, you have a similar incident, the siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, where over 75 people were killed, including a large number of children. this was once again a combined effort by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the FBI. And this was proof positive to people of this particular mindset that the government was coming after them. Now, you have to put into context that in 1992, President Bill Clinton had been elected, the first Democratic president in well over a decade, was pursuing a far more active effort at regulating firearms in the United States that was interpreted by this same community as an attempt to seize their guns. So Second Amendment rights became very prominent, and you can see this is a very combustible mixture with militia movements that believe in the right of Americans to defend themselves and also see themselves as the modern incarnations of the Minutemen of the American Revolution, ready to pick up an arm at a moment's notice to defend their inalienable rights. You have these two very dramatic incidents of, to put it mildly, government overreach that results in the tragic death of American citizens. We have the U.S. government killing American citizens. And at Waco, in the ring, let's say the protective ring around the seizure of the Branch Davidian complex, was a former U.S. Army combat veteran named Timothy McVeigh, who was selling bumper stickers supporting basically Second Amendment rights and inveighing against the government. And of course, it's McVeigh in April 1995 who, prior to the September 11th, 2001 attacks, perpetrates the most deadly terrorist incident in the United States. And that was the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City, where 168 persons perished, including the children in the infants and toddlers at the America's Daycare Center. And McVeigh himself was certainly motivated by Ruby Ridge and by Waco to perpetrate this terrible act of terrorism.
Jacob, if we can talk about sort of the ideological framework for far-right terrorism, because Bruce just described some very significant events that helped shape and responded to the far-right movement. But if we look at, say, radical Islamist jihadist violence, we have, Sayyid Qutb's milestones, for example, political Islamist texts that provide that sort of intellectual foundation of framework. Is there something akin to that for the far-right movement? I'm thinking, perhaps like the Turner Diaries, about which you write quite a lot.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, 1978, the year that the Turner Diaries are released by Andrew MacDonald writing, his name was William Luther Pierce, writing under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald. We trace that as the year that this movement really catapults. It's a book that tells the story of, in diary form, a small group of white supremacists who band together to launch a race war and eventually nuclear war to protect the white race and rebuild white America successfully. The book ends with a kamikaze suicide attack perpetrated by Earl Turner, the protagonist. The book was published in 1978, and we trace this as the moment where the movement, the violent far right in America, really got its strategic start. Violence today from the far right is often perpetrated on behalf of a strategy called accelerationism. Basically, the idea that small acts of violence perpetrated at the local level can, in fact, inspire a broader conflagration, a broader war, a broader apocalypse, in which white America will emerge triumphant from the ashes. That concept that we see today was actually articulated very, very clearly in the Turner Diaries. And so that's the book that a lot of people point to. A lot of the terminology comes from that book. Of course, on our book cover, we show a noose that was erected outside the US Capitol on January 6th. That's a reference to something in the Turner Diaries called the Day of the Rope, when all the so-called race traitors were going to be rounded up and hanged for their crimes. And so even on January 6th, you see this very clear imagery reference to the Turner Diaries, which remains an absolutely central book for the violent far right.
If we look at the sense that I'm getting is that the far right is more of a sense of an ideological sort of framework rather than a specific hierarchical organization or centralized organization. Is that a fair characterization for it? And how has the group or the movement itself evolved over time? I'm thinking in reference to your book, you talk about the transition to sort of a leaderless resistance. And it sounds like with what you were describing, Jacob, it is the gradual accumulation, or the objective, I should say, is the gradual accumulation of small incidents to lead to a larger outcome. So how has the movement evolved organizationally, strategically, and I guess doctrinally?
Sure. Well, let's talk about another key historical date. In 1988, the US government tried to bring 14 white supremacists, or tried to convict 14 white supremacists on seditious conspiracy charges at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Those 14 white supremacists, including leaders of the movement, were acquitted. A big victory for that movement, but one of the individuals, a KKK, an Aryan Nations member called Louis Beam, realized that operating in groups, operating above ground, if you like, had left the movement vulnerable to basically a decapitation. He realized that the government was very close to effectively destroying the white supremacist movement, and so he goes into the underground. He founds a journal, a magazine called The Seditionist, in direct reference to the charges, and he resurrects an old World War II strategy of insurgency called leaderless resistance. The basic concept being, if we operate above ground, we will be vulnerable to infiltration and decapitation. So we are going to operate as a network, as small cells or individuals who are not in contact with each other, operating in the underground, who lie dormant until the time is right to strike. Colloquially, we know this as lone actor or lone wolf terrorism. And in fact, as you go through the trajectory of violence that we trace from that moment, leaderless resistance is really articulated most clearly in 1992. Almost all the acts of far-right violence in this country have been perpetrated either by small cells operating independently or individuals. That trajectory runs through Oklahoma City, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Charleston, South Carolina, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Poway, California, El Paso, Texas, Buffalo, New York, and we see that abroad as well. In Oslo, the deadliest far-right terrorist attack of the 21st century happened in 2011. In Christchurch, New Zealand, of course, we're talking about a lone actor as well. So almost all the lethal violence we've seen from the far right since that 1998 trial at Fort Smith has been perpetrated by lone actors operating in a leaderless resistance. However, this is where January 6th is such an interesting question, an interesting moment, because in fact those groups did not necessarily operate as the leaderless resistance. We saw prominent groups emerge as part of this networked insurgency or insurrection that attacked the US Capitol. And in fact, after January 6th, the US government brought those seditious conspiracy charges against leaders of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys, some of the groups that the listeners will have heard of, and they succeeded where the 1988 prosecutors failed in proving that the leaders of this movement intended to, were guilty of seditious conspiracy, basically intended to overthrow the government. And so we're in a really interesting moment now, I think, where post January 6th, I'm really not sure. I'd be curious for Bruce's thoughts on this and your thoughts as well, Joshua. I'm really not sure whether the movement looks at January 6th and says, that was such a success that actually leaderless resistance holds us back and we should operate above board. We should operate as groups. We should have this public momentum, even though that leaves us vulnerable. Or if the movement says, it's not worth it because this was the largest FBI investigation in history, our groups have been taken down, kind of the violent tip of the spear has been blunted, and so we're going to go back to the leaderless resistance. January 6th was a proof of concept of leaderless resistance. I really don't know which one of those two directions they're heading, and I think that's one of the things that leads to a lot of confusion in our threat assessments right now. Was January 6th seen as a success because of the scale and the momentum, or is it seen as a failure because of those prosecutions?
I really enjoy it when guests prompt questions and kind of jump ahead in questions, because that's actually one of the questions I did want to ask. I think it's probably best for Bruce is, Where does the movement, we're jumping a bit ahead, but where does the movement go from today? Jacob just talked about the successful prosecutions that came out of January 6th. You've seen greater attention on far right movements and far right organizations, prosecutions, attention from the media and from the general public. What is the next wave of far right terrorism, and where does it go from here?
I think we'll find out in the next 3 weeks. A lot of it's going to depend on the outcome of the presidential election. And I don't think that the two potentialities that Jacob described are mutually exclusive. I think we'll see both. I don't think we're going to see people, turning up in public with all kinds of patches or T-shirts that identify their organization and, were very much in evidence on January 6th. I think people are going to be a lot more discreet because they see how all of that images recorded on cell phones, but even on stationary security cameras, on CCTV, can be used by the prosecution against them. I'd say that the danger is we'll see a combination. Probably lone wolves taking matters into their own hands, which is, of course, the focus of federal law enforcement as well as state, local, and tribal. But I think probably the Michigan Wolverines are something of a template. I mean, they were not this huge organization like the Proud Boys or like the Oath Keepers or the Three Percenters. But nonetheless, it was a group of people, many of the military veterans who had the requisite skills, combat skills, for example, and operational skills, who in that era met over Facebook. I don't think that will happen again. I would say that'll be an encrypted app like Telegram, let's say, that they might meet and come together as a very small cell. I mean, leaderless resistance was not necessarily lone wolf violence. It was the idea of small cells that couldn't be penetrated by infiltrators, which in fact the Michigan Wolverines were. So it will be groups that will have burrowed even deeper up underground, who are probably more subject to the groupthink that we know that clandestine movements in history, that terrorist groups exist not to sit on their hands, but to actually take action. And in this very clandestine, very closed environment, there's almost an information loop where they encourage one another and egg one another on and believe the situation is becoming worse and therefore they have to act. And that would be the kind of violence that I would see. And in fact, that conforms precisely to what happened in Oklahoma City in April 1995. Timothy McVeigh did not act entirely on his own. He had two co-conspirators who were fellow Army veterans, who were Army buddies of his. One of them dropped out a bit before the other. But that was, almost the archetypal type of leaderless resistance violence. And we see the enormously lethal consequences that even one or two individuals can have when 168 people perished on that date.
I want to stick with the tactics for a moment, if I could. We've seen Al Qaeda and other terrorist organizations really pursue the idea of like spectacular attacks, the propaganda of the deed, as is often called, on a very grand scale. You had the Oklahoma City bombings, a very big, spectacular attack, but the shift seems to have been over time for, as you said, small, leaderless, large mass shootings, as it were. How has that reflected both a change in either the tactics and behavior or the objectives? And do you see that continuing going forward?
That is a theme in our work, is the shift in tactics and a shift in targeting. The key year I'll point to in that regard is 2019, a year that was so devastating from a far-right terrorist standpoint that it almost earns its own chapter in our book, a chapter called The Movement Goes Global. That year we saw a trajectory of violence that struck New Zealand, the US, Norway, and Germany that all followed a familiar template. It involved a lone actor, radicalized online, using a firearm at a soft target, right? Military language for poorly defended or a community location, usually a place of worship. That became the template. It was a template that we saw in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 2018, in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, in Buffalo, New York in 2022. As you point out, that is a big shift away from the kind of spectacular terrorist attack that we saw on 9/11, that we saw in Paris and Brussels from the Islamic State. It is a different model of terrorism. Now, we trace that to be fundamentally linked to leaderless resistance, right? As terrorism has individualized, has democratized, those large-scale, high-tech, spectacular attacks have become less feasible. So you're not necessarily seeing these large explosive attacks at well-defended targets like Oklahoma City. You're seeing a different template. And I think actually the individual who encapsulates that transition better than perhaps anybody else is an individual I alluded to earlier called Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in twin attacks in Oslo, or in the Oslo area in Norway on July 22nd, 2011, because his twin attack actually encapsulated the two forms of tactics and targeting that we're talking about here. First of all, he launched a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device at the government quarter in Oslo, clearly inspired by the McVeigh incident that it is itself inspired by the car bombing of an FBI headquarters in the Turner Diaries. Complex attack, hard target, takes months of preparation, and is very dangerous to the perpetrator. That vehicle-borne improvised explosive device at the Oslo government quarter killed 8 people in Breivik's case. He then drove about an hour and a half away to a nearby island called Utøya, which was home to the summer camp of the Youth Labour Party in Norway. So there were children there at a summer camp, and he gained access to this island, and he opened fire and he killed 69 people at that location, mostly executed. Again, that's the firearm, that's the soft target, that's the poorly defended location. So he encapsulates more than anybody else, I think, that if you try to launch those spectacular attacks at hard targets using explosives, they're dangerous to yourself and they might not even be that effective. Sometimes the soft targets, the firearm attacks, the seemingly soft underbelly of society, those attacks can be far more damaging, both in death toll, lethality, but also in what it does to a country. Obviously, Norway lost an entire generation of its young future leaders in that lone actor soft target attack. So I think he shows that those attacks can be perfectly devastating. You don't need that large scale spectacular attack.
Bruce, if I can turn to you on this, because Jacob raises an interesting point that I wanted to explore, is the transnational fluid dynamic of far right terrorism from the United States to, as you referenced, Germany and Norway and other movements. How much of a dynamic and back and forth is there between different groups in different countries? How much do they influence one another? How much do they share ideological tenets, or is it just sort of a overarching umbrella term that encapsulates a lot of gradations and variability?
Well, I would say that groups, especially in Western Europe, or individuals, even more so in Western Europe. I mean, look to the United States for leadership and guidance. I mean, these concepts, leaderless resistance, for example, even though the Great Replacement theory originated with a French philosopher, it has been adopted and implemented at a far more expansive scale in the United States, for example. So the U.S., at least to many of our closest allies in Europe, is, something akin to how we criticized, for instance, Saudi Arabia or Pakistan right after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, as allowing the spread of a poisonous ideology. We see this with a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment and even violence. I mean, I'm talking about riots and other acts of violence that have occurred in Ireland and in the United Kingdom that are very influenced by political currents in the United States. I mean, Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooter who attacked 2 mosques in 2019, conceived his act, was influenced by the United States and conceived it to influence opinion in the United States and appeal to followers there. So there is very much of this circularity, but the United States is seen as sort of the leading exemplar for many of these movements elsewhere and many of these individuals elsewhere. I mean, look, this to me is, there's many things in my career that have surprised me, but amongst the most surprising things is that For instance, our closest ally, Canada, we have historically the most open border in the history of mankind. Canada has designated five groups and one individual as terrorists. The United Kingdom has designated two U.S. based groups as terrorist organizations. Australia has designated two. New Zealand has designated one. I mean, think about it. We're talking about the other Five Eyes partners. The Five Eyes is the historically unprecedented exchange of intelligence information between English speaking, very closely allied countries with similar forms of governments with commitments to the liberal democratic state. And all of our partners have designated groups or individuals within the United States as terrorists. That to me is absolutely astonishing, but shows both the magnitude of this problem and also the influence that the United States has elsewhere abroad.
I want to stick with that aspect of the influence and the spread in particular, because I was struck in your book how early adopters some of the far right groups were in terms of the internet and bulletin boards and just the use of technology very early on. Could you talk about the adoption of technology by far right groups and how has it accelerated the spread of sort of the far right ideology through social media, through I'm thinking 4chan, 8chan, 8kun, and other online outlets?
You're right, first of all, Joshua, to point out, I think it's a really important point that far right extremists were actually the first to adopt computerized technology way back in the 1980s. Our white supremacist here that I mentioned earlier, Louis Beam, adopted those technologies first. They were pioneers, and really throughout their history, they have adopted computer technology, digital technology to advance their ideology, to advance their radicalization. I argue that the story of social media radicalization over time is really a story of lowered barriers to entry, and I mean that both ideologically and tactically. So today, over the past 10 years, you've seen that template emerge that we discussed earlier with lone actors radicalized on social media. Some of the other trends that we see is ideologies appear to be less cohesive and coherent. Bruce and I write about something we call ideological convergence. The FBI has termed it salad bar extremism. The concept that individuals now are taking bits and pieces from different ideologies, forming their own justifications for violence. We see that in a lot of the cases that we discuss. So you don't necessarily have extremists reading boring old tracts of Nazi, fascist canon these days. You have them radicalizing in these very, very idiosyncratic directions on social media. And you also see the lowered barriers to entry tactically. So frequently radicalization now is occurring very quickly, and terrorists are getting younger. And so you're ending up sometimes with these very chaotic attacks with people who are poorly trained, have not conducted a lot of reconnaissance, and these attacks usually are very fast. This is all part of the social media story. I think this is a really important question, particularly in this moment, because we are on the precipice. Actually, we are over the precipice of a new generation in social media technologies with generative AI, which a lot of us working in the counterterrorism space have been aware of for a while, but those technologies have arrived now and we've all been caught off guard. The ability for extremists and people in the mainstream to create deepfakes, for example, to create untruths and to spread them at an unprecedented scale, at a greater speed, in a way that's democratizing these tools, is an incredibly powerful new tool for these groups. And as I've said elsewhere, I think if we're interested in knowing how extremists, how bad actors are going to use artificial intelligence for their own good, for their own ends, we should be looking to the violent far right to see how they're experimenting with these technologies, because the violent far right is always on the cutting edge when new revolutions in digital communications appear. Right now, we're seeing them use deepfakes as part of the election. We will see how that proceeds over the next few weeks and months.
Bruce, if I could turn to you on this, because it's very interesting, this idea that the salad bar ideology, picking and choosing kind of what you want and what you believe to come up with your own framework here. That almost seems like it is an order of magnitude more difficult to interdict or stop, because if you look at the sort of radical Islamist jihadist, the spread of the ideological framework and the robust counter-violent extremism and de-radicalization programs that are developed around that framework, there's at least some sort of coherent framework to counter. Whereas it sounds as the way Jacob's describing it, so where the FBI has come to, is that I can go and pick and choose whatever I want and I have my own framework. So how do you interdict that, and how do you de-radicalize or deprogram that?
It's enormously difficult is unfortunately the short answer. I mean, think about how we're organized to counterterrorism. I mean, we focus on ideological buckets, as it were, and on specific groups. Often, I mean, since 1997, the State Department, for instance, has had the foreign terrorist organizations designated list. Foreign terrorist organizations, but most of our conversation just now has been about not organizations and groups, but cells of individuals. You can see how it becomes exponentially much more complex when you're not only not talking about identifiable existing organizations, but smaller cells that may cross all kinds of ideological lines and ideological boundaries, which also confounds the analysis, and the ability to predict even their behavior becomes much more difficult. So we're in like this highly fluid environment where I think the animus towards government, the frustration that's felt by citizens in a variety of countries, their lack of faith in the electoral process, for example, their lack of faith and distrust of elected leaders, has led them not just to embrace violence as a solution, but to have, literally the smorgasbord of ideologies that are justifying this choice. So it's not just, as it was in the past, a stereotypical far left or far right argument, but it's ones that have to deal with Islamism, for example, mixing and matching of even ideologies that seem to be, at least on paper, diametrically opposed to one another, but nonetheless enter into a blend that I think renders tracking, identifying, and predicting far more difficult than it's ever been.
So you close the book looking at a series of recommendations and ideas of how to tackle this problem. I want to start with a very big macro kind of question, and then turn to what your thoughts on what the next Congress, for example, should do, or what the next government administration should do. At a very macro level, there seems to be a tension between whether the sedition, the insurrection, the domestic terrorism aspect is either fundamentally a criminal challenge or a national security challenge, or indeed both. Where do you stand on sort of that debate and that discussion, and how will that outcome affect the policy prescriptions?
Well, all right. Jacob's hesitant, so I'll dive in. It's both. It's criminal and it is national security, but our statutes emphasize the criminal dimension of it, I would argue, because we don't have a domestic terrorism law. Mm-hmm. And I think a domestic terrorism law would be useful because people are now charged with crimes, and all terrorism is criminal. But you can make the same argument. All hate crimes are criminal as well, of course. But in the 1990s, to express as a society, as Americans, our opprobrium for hate crimes, we superimposed on the criminal statutes, shooting people, murder, vandalism, arson, kidnapping, all these things that are also hate crimes or ordinary crimes. But on top of that, there's a structure that enables, for instance, judges to impose even longer sentences, in some cases 3 or 4 times longer. But we lack that. And to me, or I should say to both of us in framing that recommendations chapter, there was no logic to that we think there needs to be. We should be calling out this violence what it is. And I think there would be a lot more clarity about what occurred on January 6th if we had had domestic terrorism legislation that could have been used instead of the criminal statutes. At the end of the day, and Jacob talked about this earlier, one of the most significant deterrent developments, I believe, from January 6th was the successful prosecution and conviction of 22 leaders of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers on charges of seditious conspiracy. The most serious criminal charge that can be brought in a democracy. It's basically conspiring to overthrow the government, which is also what terrorism is. So I think by calling it what it is and using that label, it would have a very significant deterrent effect, which is what laws are designed to achieve as well, not just to punish the guilty, but to deter others from engaging in these kinds of acts of violence.
Jacob, did you want to add to that?
No, that was a very frightening question. I'll leave it in Bruce's excellent hands.
I think, as you mentioned, obviously we're coming up on the election here in less than 2 weeks as we're recording this. We talked a bit in the early portion of the conversation about things that you're going to be looking for, not just in this election, but going beyond it. I want to return to that question. And what are the things that you both, looking at this conversation, this discussion, this policy debate, what do you think should be part of the conversation that isn't part of the conversation right now at a practical counterterrorism policy level? But then I think this also references your response about the domestic terrorism legislation, but also at a macro policy level.
There hasn't been much reported publicly about this, but I have to believe, and I certainly hope, that the federal authorities are taking very seriously the possibility of disruptive violence on election day, which would be absolutely catastrophic if there were any sorts of incidents at a polling place. And we already know an individual was recently arrested and has been charged in Oklahoma City. Not a domestic terrorist, someone affiliated with ISIS-K, with the Islamic State's franchise in Afghanistan, who was precisely plotting to use automatic weapons. Again, from what we know, it was basically a lone wolf attack, or perhaps in league with one other person, on a polling place on election day. And I think the real fear of violence that occurs in connection with people going to vote is quite genuine and chilling. I mean, look, we're in completely uncharted waters. We've already had 2 assassination attempts on a presidential candidate in the months leading up to the election. That's completely without precedent. So therefore, I think we have to be prepared for all potentialities and all scenarios that might be specifically and deliberately designed to disrupt the U.S. electoral process, which of course many Americans have already concluded is rigged or is already preordained and is already being tilted in favor of one candidate. So we have a very volatile mix. That's my biggest concern in the coming weeks.
Jacob?
We are going to see election violence over the next few weeks. We've already seen it, as Bruce mentioned, the 2 assassination attempts. Those are the most serious incidents, but it's a drop in the bucket of what we've seen. We've seen a number of large-scale and smaller scale plots all around the country. We've seen a drumbeat of election violence already, and that is only going to escalate. I think the most volatile moment will be the days immediately after the election, where conspiracy theories start to swirl and will target local communities. So it's not like it's going to be a national level conspiracy theories. That exists, of course, but some of these theories target local communities in places that we are likely familiar with, right? Phoenix, Arizona, Atlanta, Georgia, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan. So that is a major concern. I think there's kind of it sounds odd coming out of my mouth, but in a way, the most serious possible incident, and I know the Department of Homeland Security has warned local law enforcement about precisely this eventuality, would be actually infrastructure attacks rather than human attacks. What I mean by that is, what if there's a successful disruption? What if there's a successful sabotage attack on actual ballots? What if somebody managed to successfully sabotage the voting process itself? What does that mean if the actual election is disrupted somewhere, or if ballots are found and sabotaged? Does that mean you're in a situation where you have to redo certain elections? That would lead to an extremely damaging environment for conspiracy theories, I think, and that is a real fear of mine. on January 6th, there is some untold story about a clerk who picked up actual paper ballots and carried them out of the U.S. Capitol. We were very lucky in that regard because a successful, sabotage attack on actual infrastructure related to the election could be devastating in creating a real wasteland of a real unprecedented scenario that we wouldn't really know, I think, how to respond to. So that is my great fear heading into the next few weeks here.
I want to ask one more question if I could. We're running up on unfortunate times that this conversation could keep going quite easily. Looking beyond just the forthcoming election here, I mean, Jacob, you talked about generative intelligence or generative AGI, deep fakes, things along those lines, and the confluence of ideological frameworks with technology. If we fast forward beyond just this next election, but looking at the trajectory of the United States, obviously you mentioned conspiracy theories, you've mentioned the deep fake aspect, you've mentioned the concerns about the pick and choosing of ideological frameworks. What does this challenge look like if unchecked in 5 years' time, for the sake of argument? And then what do we need to do to offset that risk today to ensure that that future doesn't happen in 5 years?
Let me approach this from a few ways. First of all, I think the impact of artificial intelligence, if it's not checked in the information space, is going to be to delegitimize all information. So we are already in a space where individuals of authority, including President Trump, including Elon Musk, are trafficking in artificially generated content. Ultimately, that content is going to be so good that all content online is going to be questioned as being artificial intelligence. That means legitimate content that reflects badly on people can be dismissed as AI. It is really going to be a chaotic space. Bruce and I, in our work, we call for a reform of Section 230, which would, if nothing else, at least allow people to hold social media companies accountable for content on their sites. That's not just an extremism question, it's foreign state information, it's child sexual abuse material, it's body eating disorder content. We believe that social media companies have been given too long of a leash for too long of a period, and that at some point we need to have a more serious conversation at the federal level from a legislation standpoint about what it means to create a healthier information ecosystem. However, it would be remiss of me not to mention that the vast majority of violence that we see from the violent far right in the United States is actually gun violence. And I think to a certain extent, we can talk about combating ideology, we can talk about combating the spread of radicalization and rhetoric online. We can talk about domestic terrorism legislation. We can talk about prevention, which is how you try to strengthen resilience against extremist content. But at the end of the day, when an individual, a radicalized individual, winds up arriving on scene to conduct an act of terrorism, that act is an act of gun violence. And it's going to be really difficult for us to make lasting inroads against this movement from a counterterrorism perspective without having some kind of serious conversation about the proliferation of firearms in our society and why it's been allowed to corrode and destroy so many communities. Pass it to Bruce for any final thoughts.
I don't know what it'll be like in the next 5 years. I think, 5 years ago in 2019, we couldn't have predicted the contested election of 2020. Certainly, we could never have predicted the events that transpired on January 6th, 2021, the 2 assassination attempts that have occurred this year. So it's difficult to say. I think a lot will depend on who is elected president and how smooth that process is or isn't as we get towards January 6, 2025, when on that date the U.S. Congress will meet to certify the results of the Electoral College. I don't want to appear flippant because this is quite serious, but I always believe that popular culture is a window onto understanding society. And if you think back to almost 30 years ago in 1995, there was that hit film Independence Day, where aliens descend from outer space to destroy the White House, and we could all go to that, go to the movie theaters and guffaw at the implausibility and impossibility of that ever materializing. And when we think what was one of the films released earlier this year, in fact, by an English director, Civil War, which depicts an assault, an all-out assault on the White House, and the fact that in 2024 and probably into 2025, that has become somewhat of a plausible or at least believable or possible scenario, I mean, speaks to, I think, just the really very powerful centrifugal currents that exist in the United States that certainly have not been allayed by this electoral cycle and will manifest themselves in some manner. We don't know exactly how, but certainly will be present. But that sort of juxtaposition between the White House being attacked in 1995 cinematically and being completely unrealistic, and then seeing it in 2024 and drawing people to the movie theaters because they believe another civil war is indeed a possibility in the United States, I mean, shows really on what unsteady and shaky ground the country is at this very moment.
Well, I think we're going to have to look to Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum to save the day, perhaps for this in 2025. So with that, and on that note, I think it's going to bring our episode to a close. I want to thank Bruce and Jacob for joining us today to discuss their book, God, Guns, and Sedition. Thanks, as always, to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff in helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts, and it will also be available on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks. And as always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. So thank you very much for joining us. Bruce, Jacob, it was absolutely fantastic.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having us.